Welcome to the Health Feeds Performance podcast, where we believe that whole body nourishment is a requisite for athletic success. I'm your host, Ian Craig from the Centre for Integrative Sports Nutrition, and today I'm with Justin Roberts, Professor Justin Roberts from Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. So our topic today is blue zones, and it might be an expression of our age, Justin, that both of us are interested in longevity and health span and that sort of thing. But the blue zones are areas within the world where an unusual number of healthy centurions have been found. And there was a book called The Blue Zones about 20 years ago, and since then there's been quite a lot of research in that arena. And Justin is one of these individuals who's taken some interest in that. So what we're going to do tonight is look at the blue zones and just ask the question, can we learn from these healthy individuals and extract some of the things that they're doing into the context of an athlete's life? So Justin, over to you. If you can just provide a bit of an intro to yourself for the audience, and say why you're interested in the blue zones.
Well, welcome everyone to the podcast, and thanks Ian for the invitation. Good to see you. The people on the call, I think some of you already know me, but for those that haven't met me before, my name's Justin. I'm a professor of nutritional physiology applied to exercise and functional health at Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge. So I've had a long background in sport and exercise and performance, working with many individuals from complete novices all the way through to world record athletes and Olympians, etc. I've obviously got the experience, if you like, when it comes to how people function and how people perform from a dietary perspective. But I've also, my research interests have often have spanned a wide range of nutritional related concepts, from protein related ideas all the way through to lately polyphenols. And for those that know me, you'll know that I've had a constant interest in things like green tea extracts, and more recently we're looking at the polyphenols that you find in olives, particularly olive fruit water, and the potential benefit they may have on exercise in some capacity, whether that's reducing oxidative stress or enhancing oxygen consumption during exercise or improving recovery in some format. So we have a number of researchers doing work on that area. But it was interesting because as part of that, I've been to a few interesting places in the world, and one of them was kind of northern Italy. And at the same time I was in northern Italy, visiting a farm that is the largest biodynamic farm in Europe. I came across somebody said to me, you should watch this documentary on Netflix, Blue Zones and Live to 100, and it sparked my interest, and I kind of watched this documentary, and I was like fascinated with it because it just transpires that one of the blue zone areas, which is Sardinia, I've literally just come back from Sardinia, and I actually went to one of the blue zone areas, which was fascinating, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So I had got very much interested into why people are living to a ripe old age, shall we say, but not just living to a long age, but actually living functionally active as well. And so I started to look into some of the research. I've done a few presentations on this now, because I don't think it's as clear cut as sometimes the literature makes it. And but there are some interesting concepts that come out of the blue zones. And going back to the sport area, one of the things I'm really fascinated by is we talk very much in sport as in terms of the science, means and standard deviations, and what we should do on average for people. But of course, athletes are individuals in their own right. And as you know, we're doing a book on this at the moment. We're writing a big textbook on integrative sports nutrition, as you know. And I think many of the concepts, ironically, from the blue zones probably could translate into sport and exercise, which I'm sure we'll come on to later on.
Thanks, Justin. So, blue zones. What are there were 5 areas identified originally, weren't they? So do you want to sort of just share those? But also your thoughts about just the concept of blue zones, old-fashioned living. and how there's probably a lot more than just 5 blue zones in the world.
Yeah, so again, just for the listeners, if you've never heard of the blue zones or you've not seen any of the books or the documentaries that are out there, there's a lot of interest in the concept of longevity, people living beyond 100 and even super centenarians that live beyond 110. And one of the original researchers was Poulan's group, who were looking at, I think the original study was the AKEA study, A-K-E-A, AKEA study, which from memory translates as a Kent Annos, or health and life to 100, or something like that. But these were the first kind of researchers to look at areas where people were living beyond 100, and they ironically, I mean, I'm sure most of your listeners probably know this, but the original researchers had a map of Sardinia, which is where the first one was kind of depicted, and they used a blue marker pen to locate hotspots, if you like, around Sardinia. And that's kind of how it became known as the blue zones, believe it or not. So, you know, if it had been a red pen, it might have been red zones, who knows? And I do know other authors that have referred to red and white zones as well. But the blue zones are areas where we're looking at centenarian prevalence, people that are living beyond 100. And specifically, what was interesting about Sardinia is, or rather, what's interesting about longevity is we know that, you know, if you look at males versus females, women tend to outlive men on average across the world. And what was interesting about Sardinia is there was a higher prevalence of men, you know, so the ratio between men and women was quite balanced. But what they found was when they looked at some of the the traditional cultures in Sardinia, if any of you have travelled to Sardinia, you'll know that particularly in the centre part of Sardinia, it's fairly mountainous, it's very rural, and it largely comes from a shepherding type background. So you've got, you know, farming and shepherding cultures there. So there is kind of a question mark around, you know, is there a genetic kind of protection that's going on? Is it the type of foods they're eating? Is it the environment and the landscape that they're working and living in? And we'll probably come on to some of these, but Sardinia was one of the first ones because of the prevalence of men in particular that were living beyond 100, and that was noted. And if you get a map of Sardinia and you look right in the middle of the island and go slightly east, you'll find an area called Nuoro, I think it's called, the Nuoro province. And if you look at some of the villages scattered around Nuoro in the mountains, they're kind of renowned for being some of the kind of restricted blue zone areas, or the traditional blue zone areas. And like I said, I was there only a few weeks ago, and what I picked up on is the simplicity, the fact that, you know, if you look at most of us, we're very busy. I don't know, people on the call, for example, you know, you probably just got in from work and it's all go go go. And the first thing that stood out to me when I got to one of these zones was just the contrast in terms of simplicity, basicness, slowing down, you know, less rushed, more time. More time with people in terms of eating and exercising or socializing. So all of those came out. Now that's just one zone or one area. And what some of these researchers have discovered is when they've found other locations, they found similar centenarian prevalences, if you like. So you know, the 5 that have historically, or rather more popularly been noted are, I've mentioned Sardinia, but you've also got places like Icaria in Greece, which is one of the islands. You've got places like Okinawa in Japan, places like the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, and you've got places like Loma Linda in California. And just going back to Greece, we talk about places like Icaria, and I do wonder if this is kind of just a representation of some of the other islands, because in the literature they talk very much about, well, it's an island and it's isolated, and, you know, not so much input from outside, but, you know, there's lots of islands. So I wonder if this is just a typical island, and actually if you go across many of the other islands you see a similar pattern, and I wonder if it's the same in places like Japan as well. But also we talk about these blue zones, and I should also just quickly throw in there that there are many places in the world that are not historically or traditionally called blue zones, but they have fairly high levels or prevalence of centenarians. And you've only got to go to some of the big cities, and if you look at prevalence rates, some of the big cities could actually qualify as technically a blue zone by sheer numbers.
So I've sailed quite a bit in Greece, and yeah, I'll definitely back up what you said about Icaria in Greece. Is it just a representation of an island? Because you sail up and you put the anchor down. There's one little taverna on the beach, and you have this amazing Greek salad. Where did the tomatoes come from? Well, that hillside behind us. Where did the olives come from? Well, the next farm over. Where's the wine from? Oh, we made it from the grapes on the island. Where's the feta cheese from? Oh, the village goat. So it's that real basicness that I think is really important in all of this. We've sort of obviously changed in the westernized world. What with that thought, Justin, is there any sort of representation in the Blue Zones literature of changes, like in a negative way, influence of the westernized ways, maybe reducing, shrinking the Blue Zones, or affecting the sort of the overall health of them?
That's an outstanding question. So yes is the answer. Not necessarily across all the areas. I mean, for example, if you look at places like Okinawa, the original findings come from people that are already in their kind of 80s, 90s, and 100s. But if you start thinking about how the island has changed with younger generations, or the input of fast food outlets, for example, potentially, we can't look at longevity in a younger cohort, but I wonder if this is going to have an impact on longevity in the longer term. So yeah, yes, there is evidence of that. Not everywhere, but in some places there is evidence of changes to the traditional culture, obviously, and that might have an influence on longevity. And when we talk about longevity, it's the question I often get asked is, so what's the magic formula? How do we all live to a long age? Do we have to go and drink water from a certain place, or do we have to eat certain foods from a certain place? And I think that's just the question's too big and too complex. It's not like there's one thing that if everyone did it, it would equal long life, because each of these cultures, each of these regions has their own unique way of living, and most importantly, interacting with the environment. So, what you do in one location. If I went and ate the diet of the Costa Ricans, for example, and I translated that to Greece, well, it doesn't necessarily work that way. The people that have lived on those islands or those locations have grown up and historically lived this way for their lives. So, of course, they've adapted to that lifestyle and that diet and that type of way of living. So it's not one thing. I think it's multiple things. And the bigger question is, what can you take from those blue zones and put it into either a sporting or a Western culture? And that's where it starts to get a bit more exciting. But let's start off with the blue zones and see where you go with that one.
So the question there kind of reminds me of the old debate on like Kenyan runners. So what's their magic formula? Is it their genetics? Is it the altitude? Is it what they eat? And that's been debated for many years. And like you say with the blue zones with health, there's multiple variables involved in that answer. So you mentioned simplicity, you mentioned dietary factors, you mentioned shepherding lifestyle in Sardinia. List a few other ones that have kind of come through the research so far.
Yeah, so there was, I can't remember the paper, but there was one paper that talked about going back to Sardinia, and this idea of the quote I remember in my head was, it's not what they do, it's how they do it that seemed to stand out. So, again, if I just pick on that particular blue zone, you've got obviously what I call a semi-nomadic diet. In other words, it's fairly not basic foods, but foods that are seasonally harvested or at the time available. Often quite simplistic foods, things like sourdough bread, cheeses, as you mentioned, their own wine, the famous Sardinian Canino wine, which I have to say I did try when I was over there, quite strong. But also this concept of what I call stress resilience. So one thing I picked up on traveling around some of these mountainous regions is not because it's in the mountain, but some of the villages were they had flat parts, but they also had quite steep parts as well in terms of the streets, the back streets in particular. So if you're living in that environment and you're having to walk up and down these areas however many times a day, for older people, that's the equivalent of a workout. If you think about it, they're actually using their muscles in a more you know regular manner throughout their days. And how many of us in our day-to-day jobs are not active? We're just sitting down or sedentary, and then we're expecting our muscles to function. So that could be a key component. So it's partly how they're using their muscles on a day-to-day basis, and partly the downshifting or the down time that they have. So I picked up on people sitting at the sides of the road just talking to their friends. I saw some elderly people literally walking through the road, just having a walk and a chat, middle of the day. So I wonder if there's this balance between, if you like, stress, physical stress, mental stress, if you like, but particularly the physical stress of movement in the area, coupled with the kind of downshifting, the downtime, and that balance between, if you like, parasympathetic and sympathetic activity. I wonder if that has a fundamental role to play. That's Sardinia. If you then flip it to places like Okinawa, one of the things that stands out, and you'll see this on the documentaries if you've watched any of them, but one of the staples of Okinawa is this purple sweet potato, which is really high in certain antioxidants. And when you contrast that with the traditional Japanese diet, it's grossly different in terms of percentage of the diet. So I want, and that particular sweet potato is effectively a kind of famine staple. It came out of times when it was easier to grow those sort of potatoes. So I wonder if there's kind of a link between the original culture and what's the word I'm looking for, the norm, if you like, what they're used to doing. So those sort of foods were often seen as, or still are seen as, medicinal. So when you go to certain blue zones, you pick up on this concept of medicinal food or food as medicine, which is another thing to pick up on.
I think that's a good time to just go into quality and quantity of food, because we're stuck in the scientific way of thinking of carbs, fats, proteins, and for an athlete or for an individual, we need to be having a certain percentage out of these macronutrients. But it's not just about the quantity, is it? We need to be considering, what does that get made up of? Perhaps because of too much very refined carbohydrate, we're now in this low carb era of scientists jumping from one side to another. But when you go to rural locations, listening to these kind of diets, and I've also seen papers coming out of like the Amazonian jungle, they're not eating low carb diets, but they're eating food that's come from the ground that they live within. So the Japanese example there, purple sweet potato, which are obviously high in polyphenols compared to majority of the population will be on white sticky rice. Do you want to sort of just comment a wee bit on that?
So like I said, one of the things I picked up on was this idea of Mediterranean style diets or medicinal foods. And if you go to places, one of the things I picked up on, you mentioned about carbohydrates there. One of the things I picked up on was when you look at places like Nicoya, traditionally they've eaten very not basic foods, but locally cultivated foods, including things like corn, squash, and beans, which they refer to as the three sisters, but also rice as well. And these are all starchy carbs, but obviously you've got the low glycemic index factor, you've got the naturality of it, etc., etc. And then you go to other places like Okinawa, and they see all of their foods as having medicinal purposes. Like the one that stands out to me was seaweed, because of its ability to combat the heat in some capacity. But then you've got things like tofu, which we're all aware of the potential benefits there. And then you flip it and you go to places like Loma Linda, where the particular culture, Seventh-day Adventists, historically, or rather in the literature, is often referred to as, vegan, vegetarian, largely, nuts and seeds and vegetables. But of course, when you read into the literature a bit more, what you actually see across all of the blue zones is a fairly mixed approach. So in other words, certain foods like meats in moderation, and that's the key word, moderation. Um, One of the questions I got asked recently was it all comes down to caloric restriction, because in these blue zone areas they're all not eating a massive amount of food compared to Western societies. Now that might be partly true, but not consistently true. So there are some locations where there's limited evidence of caloric restriction, but there are also other areas where the food intake could be, classically referred to as partially caloric restriction.
Right, so let's go sciencey for a few minutes. We've got AMPK, which is a precursor to mitochondrial biogenesis or mitochondrial growth, and that's spurred a lot of research recently. And within food, caloric restriction is known to fire up AMPK expression, which kind of makes sense. If you're not eating as much as maybe the body needs, we need an adaptation to try and use the energy that we have better. But AMPK is also stimulated by lots of polyphenols, and that's one of your research interests. So can you just say a wee bit more about the importance of polyphenols? And this feeds into, it's not how much is in the diet, it's what is in the diet, and are we getting enough polyphenols, antioxidants, vitamins and minerals from the soil?
I think you've just said it. Yeah, I mean, so, there's a really nice paper by Longo and Anderson that's published in Cell in 2022, I believe it was, where they proposed a nice little model of what they call the longevity diet, or a longevity diet. And one of the things they talk about is this idea of, if we can reduce some of the kind of negative dietary factors in our diet, let's say it's animal fats, high sugars, high fat, high protein, and specifically the high protein they refer to as being quite negative. In terms of longevity, they talk about aging being related to this concept of chronic cellular hyperfunction. In other words, it's over amplification of cell responses, particularly things like inflammation, oxidative stress, and insulin regulation. So on the one hand, that's what they were saying kind of leads to a state of aging. And then they flip it and say, well, actually, if you kind of reverse some of this and you have, maybe slightly less calories going in, maybe some protein restriction, which I'm not 100% sure I agree with, and I'll explain why if you want me to. But then they talk about the idea of the carbohydrates being around 45-50% of the diet as more kind of non-processed, and that's another thing to pick up on, and more plant-based in its origin. Then you start to look at the diversity in the diet, which might be triggering some of these pathways that lead to things like autophagy or cell protection. So on the one hand, we look at longevity. If we then flip that back to sport, if we can get more diversity into the diet, not only does it have an impact on how the gut functions, but it also might have an impact on how cells regulate and protect themselves. So in other words, in terms of recovery from exercise, the diversity of the diet could be quite key into how we then adapt to the actual training we're doing.
Right, so you brought up two things there that I want to go into. Let's talk about protein, because that's quite interesting. In the athletic world, it's generally considered 1.6 grams per kilo body mass per day that athletes should consume, but that will obviously vary with demands and size and sport. But then in health literature, you've got the China study from years ago, and they were finding that even quite modest protein levels were linking to cancer incidence. There's a little caveat here, though, that nobody seems to have been aware of, and that is that it was in the Chinese population. So does the Chinese population span out to the rest of the world? That's a bit of a question mark. So in the blue zone kind of consideration, maybe we don't need consistently high protein levels to be healthy. But in the Western world with high stress levels, we should probably talk about cortisol. cortisol is catabolic, and heightened cortisol, you might need a higher protein in the diet to compensate for that. So there's a few things there, Justin, if you want to try and unpack.
So let's start with the kind of protein needs for sport. We, as you said, we often hear this kind of 1.6 grams per kilo. Um, Several things to pick up on there. One, it depends on the type of athlete, the type of individual, whether they're well trained, whether they're what they're training for specifically. And these numbers typically relate to maximum protein synthesis rates. So when you start to get into that 1.6, 1.7, 1.8, typically in terms of fractional synthetic rate of muscle, you're kind of getting close to maxing out what has been shown in the literature. Now, the caveat to that is if you that's per day. If you then start looking at what you might need on a per meal basis, we can start to see differences between younger and older people. Now, of course, then you throw into the equation the amount of protein that someone needs. If I go and look at, say, a 50 kilo athlete versus a 120 or even larger, I'm thinking like a rugby player or something like that, or even pro bodybuilders, they consume far in excess of that and do very well. So, we have to think of protein as more than just muscle function. So yes, I agree with the science and the fact that the fractional synthetic rate is maxed out somewhere between 1.6 and 1.8 depending on the individual. But then you layer into that training status. So we know that particularly people that are well trained, their protein needs are likely going to go down because they're more efficient in their metabolism and how they utilize that protein. And of course, we talk very much about protein from a resistance training perspective, but if you think about endurance training, it's not just muscle protein, but mitochondrial proteins as well that are influenced by the need for protein. Then you flip it back to longevity in the blue zones. I said I slightly disagree with the concept of protein restriction, because we know that protein stimulates mTOR pathways and specifically the amino acid leucine. So maybe the answer lies in when we eat and how we eat. So for example, from a longevity perspective, it might be that you need less protein at certain points of the day, i.e. when you're not exercising or you physically have exerted your muscle. But then once you have done something that you would consider physically exerting your body, maybe that's the time to put the protein in. So this idea of feasting and famine, if you like, might come into play. So I know there's a lot of evidence behind time-restricted feeding and partial caloric restriction, but there might also be a time to actually look at when protein is going in as well.
So how do we apply that in an athletic kind of model? The time-restricted feeding, yes, there's some nice research coming out there from different variables, like certainly insulin resistance is a key one that they've looked at. But when you've got an athlete that needs to be training hard almost every single day, how do you think that works into their regime?
In terms of protein or in terms of the blue zones?
In terms of time-restricted feeding.
Yeah, so I think it largely comes down to the goal and what they're trying to achieve. If you've got someone who's training 2 or even 3 times a day, then it can be some people will find that quite challenging. I think the first thing is to look at the individual. And this is one of the first things we say in our book, which is, the idea of an individual response to both diet and exercise. But also, I think, the time restricted feeding could be useful in someone who might be looking to adapt at the beginning of their training program or season. But then if you're going into competition where the intensity might be going up, some people will tell me actually they've been doing time restricted feeding quite well during competition or during intensive training. Others will say, actually, no, I feel like I need a lot more food going in. So it depends on what the definition of time restricted feeding and also the amount of food that's being consumed in that window. Relatively speaking, most people I talk to kind of restrict between about 11 and 6 p.m. or roughly that window. And all they're doing is they're taking their sort of 2,500 calories and just compressing it into a shorter period of time in terms of when they're eating. So instead of having their breakfast, lunch and dinner, they're effectively having lunch, afternoon and dinner. So they're not really missing out too much. That's all well and good if you've got someone who is a recreational individual and maybe going to the gym 2 or 3 times a week. But then if you layer into that someone who is, requiring more like 3 to 4,000 plus calories a day, and we're not even going to get into the elite athletes here that might need several thousand calories a day, that becomes a lot harder to do. So I think it comes down to the type of individual, their goals, and what they're actually training for.
Okay, so let's come back to gut, which I was going to do anyway with the microbiome thing you mentioned earlier with the blue zones. But now you've talked about caloric needs of elite athletes who are training a lot. So the work of Herman Poncer from Duke University has talked about the gut potentially being a limiter of athletic success, which is the first time I've seen that written anywhere, which makes you think, well, how important is the gut? Thankfully, we're now getting a bit of research within the microbiome in sports science, sports medicine kind of context, but it's very focused in on the microbiome and not the whole digestive sort of capability. Can you translate a wee bit then from the blue zones, polyphenols and diversity and so on into an athletic gut? What can we learn from them that can then go into athletic behavior?
That's a challenging one. I don't know if we can necessarily translate from one to the other. I mean, one thing we picked up on when we looked at some of the literature on the blue zones was just the concept of diversity. It's not, whilst they may have certain staples in their diet, there seems to be a wide variety of foods in their diet across the blue zones, by the way. So, it's food diversity, fiber. Big one is the fiber. I picked up on, in fact, I can't think of a blue zone that doesn't have a significant amount of fiber in their diet. I could be wrong there, but I can't remember, or I can't remember seeing that. So fiber and diversity are the two key ones. Plus, you layer into that the glycemic load of the diet, which is typically lower. So those three things will impact things like appetite regulation, things like the desire for snacking in between meals, and most importantly, the things like the biotic diversity. And of course, we know that things like fiber in particular have an impact on short-chain fatty acid production. Now, in the world of sport and exercise, we're still at the kind of early emerging stages of where the gut might have an important impact on physical and muscular performance. So one of the kind of hypotheses is that if the gut is producing short-chain fatty acid, what impact do those short-chain fatty acids have on either the muscular environment in terms of the inflammation or anti-inflammation effect, but also the signaling pathways that might allow muscle to regenerate, restore, or even rebuild quicker. So in terms of glycogen recovery or muscle protein synthesis. But the science, we're still not quite there yet. So we still need a lot more science to really understand whether this is factual or not, or whether there is actually a gut muscle axis for athletes. So I think there are some lessons there. Going back to sport and exercise, and I'm sure there are people on the call here that work with athletes, but from my experience, most athletes are pretty habitual in their thinking around diet. In other words, if they like a certain food, they're going to keep eating that particular food, chicken and rice, pasta and whatever it may be. And you tend to find that the diversity is quite limited in some athletes. So I'm not suggesting they don't eat enough food or enough fiber, but I am suggesting that maybe the nutritional diversity of the diet could be one factor that might be useful for them.
So in nutrition, we get fashions. And you've mentioned two kind of fashions that you don't hear very much now. One's fiber. So fiber, I think, was the 1990s. Like, we all need so much fiber, but we're now in an era of a lot of people talking about the low carb approach, and then fiber is not really considered. You can make a huge difference to the health of a diet with the same number of grams of carbohydrate with more fiber versus less. And the second thing you mentioned there was a glycemic index or glycemic load, and they were fashionable in the early 2000s. And again, you don't hear that much about them. So with increasing your fiber in your diet, it will decrease the glycemic index of, let's say, a carbohydrate-rich meal. And I think that's really, really important to remember. And you also mentioned that fiber feeds the short chain fatty acids, so it's a diversity, microdiversity stimulant in the gut. So one of your research interest areas, Justin, you mentioned the gut-muscle axis. Can you just sort of stress, I mean, it's a bit of a hypothetical thing at the moment. If we improve the gut health, we may reduce inflammation and then improve outcome from a muscular perspective or even a joint perspective. Can you just kind of give us a bit more information or detail about where is that at the moment, and just affirm how important that gut is?
Yeah. It's a difficult one to answer, this one, because first and foremost, variability is the key word here. So if I take 100 people and I look at how they exercise and what they eat, you'll find 100 different responses. And of course, you know, when we talk about the gut microbiota, we kind of refer to it, you know, as a thing, but actually it's a dynamic, complex, interacting mechanism. And so whilst we can pick up patterns, the challenge is that what works for one won't necessarily work for another. So we know that exercise has a role to play on how the gut functions and how the biota develops as well. And there are particular strains in the biota that have been linked to exercise performance, particularly in animal models. But there have been some studies that have demonstrated an increase in certain strains post-exercise or with prolonged training, as in, you know, team sports, for example. And part of that could be down to the type of diet they're eating. In terms of what's going on at the muscle, you know, we're kind of we're still a long way from determining whether there are particular strains that are performance strains, but there are a few that have been detected in the literature that might have performance qualities, shall we say. So I think we've got a long way to go, but I do think that, you know, if you look at most athletes, that one of the big things I used to pick up on in endurance sports was this concept of, you know, the gut being the limiting factor in whether they actually finish training or finish the event. So, and part of that is how they fed in the event, but also how their gut has responded to that event. So I think the diet quality and diversity is one thing, but also how we adapt to our training and our diet is also another thing as well.
So just say a wee bit more about that, because I know you're keen on gut training, certainly in an endurance athlete perspective. So see if you can bring any Blue Zones learning into that answer as well. Just challenge you.
That's a challenging one. I mean, you know, I'm interested in, as those on the call probably know, I've had a background looking at endurance and ultra endurance areas. And of course, when we start looking at exercise intensity and duration, you're putting a lot more stress on the gut. So the minute we start exercising, clearly, where do we want the blood? We want it in our muscles, or kind of helping the muscles to function. We don't really need it too much in the gut. So what happens is you get this movement of blood flow away from the gut, which means that your gut becomes partially ischemic. And in extreme states, if I do like a marathon or an ultra marathon, where you're really putting a lot of time stress on the gut, this is where you might get changes in how the gut functions, particularly permeability of the gut. And so there are many papers that are showing evidence of increased permeability, increased endotoxemia-like symptoms in athletes. And the range of GI symptoms that are experienced with sport are quite broad and very individualized. So on the one hand, one way to tackle that is to look at what you do leading into an event, and the concept of gut training is one of those things. And there are multiple strategies that might enhance your ability to utilize energy. Interestingly enough, when you start looking at the more elite sports or kind of the more elite athlete, one of the hypotheses at the moment is that actually they need to have a lot more, or they naturally consume a lot more than maybe we kind of think they should, because of how their gut is functioning. They can use more of that carbohydrate. We're talking about very well-trained athletes here. But how that relates to the Blue Zones, I don't know, because there was a paper I found that looked at the biotic patterns, if you like, across not necessarily Blue Zones, but different locations where people were living to, you know, beyond 100, shall we say. And it seems to me that depending on where you are in the world, you almost have your own type of signature or fingerprint pattern for your biota. specific to that area. So I think it partly has a role to play on where you are. I think it partly has a role to play on what you're eating, but bringing it back to sport, I think it also has partly has a role to play on what you're doing as well.
So here's a question on the food for an athlete. In the literature, if it's an endurance event, we tend to hear recommendations to go onto a higher glycemic, more refined carbohydrate diet before, let's say, running a marathon. So we've just been talking about microbial diversity and purple sweet potatoes. I've never seen purple sweet potatoes in UK supermarkets, but we get plenty of nice orange ones, which would be high in carotenoids. So do we trade out those nice polyphenol-rich root vegetables with, let's say, white rice before an event? Or is that a situational question as well?
I mean, my personal view on this would always be, natural foods first, and the higher the quality of those foods, the better. But I think we also need to distinguish between training and event. There are certain events in the world where, you have to carry your own food, and so the quality of that food is going to be different because of the nature of that specific event, like multi-day running events. But then what you eat in training is down to you. You have more control over that. So I think it's context specific and context dependent. But I would always advocate dietary quality over anything, really, to be honest, because one of the biggest things I've seen is when people change the quality of their diet, they seem to get more nourishment. And I think that's a key word. I don't hear enough in the literature athletes referring to themselves as feeling like they've nourished, that their diet is nourishing them. I get a lot of comments like, the diet fills me up and I feel like I need a lot of calories. But very rarely do I hear an athlete actually say, God, this food's really doing me some good, or it's really nourishing me. So I would argue that dietary quality is kind of the key thing here.
Nourishment's one of my favorite words. I really struggle with the word fuel. It's almost like just putting petrol in your car, but we're slightly more complex than cars. So any other thoughts on blue zone application to sports people, Justin? What other aspects of their life, their simplicity, their stress management, their food, their movement patterns, can we actually apply across to a Western athlete? Could be recreational, it could be just somebody going to the gym 3-4 times a week, trying to stay healthy within a busy lifestyle. Could be an elite end, I'm watching the Tour de France at the moment. So these guys, all they do is sleep, train, eat, repeat. So what do you think?
Well, I suppose, one thing that leaps out to me, just as you say that, is the concept of what people do over the day. So we talk about exercise activity, like being an athlete, going and training in the gym or out on the track or wherever it is. But that's obviously just exercise itself, that single session. One of the things I picked up on when I looked at some of the blue zone areas is the concept of non-exercise activity. So what they're doing habitually. And this idea of what I call micro movements or small bouts of physical activity or exertion throughout the day, across the whole day, think about what that does in terms of your metabolic needs, for example, and are you actually getting that fuel in? So for an athlete, one of the things I would look at is what else they're doing outside of activity, outside of their habitual training. Because I think that has a role to play as well in things like heart rate variability are likely going to be affected by how you recover. So again, when I picked up on the blue zones and recovery, it wasn't so much they've exerted themselves, now they have to do this massive act of recovery. It was more like balancing. There were times when they felt like, okay, we need to downshift here, we need to take time out, let the body catch up a little bit, maybe also mental recovery as well. And then coupling that with physical exertion or mental exertion. So this idea of this stress balance, I think, is really key. How many athletes do we know that in their world, performance is everything, training is everything, and then overtraining becomes the issue or underperforming. So that balance between training and and recovery, and particularly sleep and recovery and less stress, I think is quite key as well. The other thing I picked up on, and this is probably a bit stereotypical, but when you look at a map of the blue zones, they're not on the equator, but they are very close to areas where there's probably more sunlight. I wonder how much the location has a role to play on things like vitamin D metabolism, and how much that has a role to play on mental health and well-being. So looking at the location, but also looking at what you're doing in your diet and how that has a role to play on your mental well-being as well.
Yeah, that's an important one. I remember the final year of my running career, I went out to Australia for my winter training, which was actually their summer, which really helped a lot because I always found I got a bit depressed in the long British winters, tended to get injured because it was a long training session. So I just swapped out and had 2 summers. And I still got injured, but I enjoyed myself a bit more. So I think as an athlete, yeah, using training camps or different destinations can be good if you're elite enough to be able to do that. Going on holiday, but you mentioned vitamin D. I mean, that's a whole huge research area on its own. If you are staying through the winter in a sort of place that lacks sunlight, checking vitamin D levels, I think, is quite important, and just modulating a supplement intake there. Commenting on your balance, I often talk about the yin-yang. So, the exercise is yang. So if the rest of your life is also yang, i.e. stressful job, family commitments, not getting enough sleep, the yin is obviously your sleep and good nutrition and downshifting. Sitting on the curb and talking to your neighbor, like in the blue zones, I think that's fundamental. Just say a wee bit more about cortisol, Justin, in terms of, if an athlete is sitting or living with high levels of cortisol, what effect that can have on their expectation for training load and recovery.
Well, it's going to make it harder. It's going to probably impact it in a slightly negative way in terms of the speed of adaptation or the impact of the quality of those adaptations. So, it's one of those areas where we need definitely some more kind of individual research in terms of what an athlete's specifically going through. One of the ways that many athletes monitor their kind of stress levels is through things like heart rate variability or morning heart rate, for example, and because they're more readily available. But cortisol will in the right way can impact on training. We obviously need cortisol for things like energy mobilization. So you do want that response, but it's if you've got a chronic overproduction of cortisol, or kind of cortisol being produced when you don't need it because of stress, that it can start to have an impact on adaptations and recovery. And I think also it has an impact on things like sleep patterns as well. So, we used to get athletes that were training quite late in the day, having had quite a stressful job, and then not sleeping well. And of course, the sleep quality has a significant impact on how you recover for the next day as well. So your return to readiness or your return to training could be impacted as well.
Right. Finally, I want to go back to resilience. You mentioned it earlier within the blue zones. Athletes need to obviously train resilience, but it's, again, another fashionable area. Should athletes be looking to do certain things in their day to try and build resilience? Should cold water immersions and intermittent fasting regimes be in there? Or is the training itself enough to build resilience?
I think the expression is train smart, not necessarily. It's a difficult one because in again, context specific, there are certain sports where I would argue that kind of specific competition resilience, or that kind of impact resilience, if it's a particularly physical sport, you need it. But the classic one is when a team's under immense stress in a competition phase, you can't really train for that. You have to just it's the experience that comes with competitive or repetitive competitions, for example. So I think experience has a role to play there. In terms of resilience itself, that's a great question because we've got many types of resilience. You've almost got the hormetic concept of resilience, where too much of something is not necessarily great, and too little of something may not be enough. So it's finding that sweet spot. But I think also we can overplay resilience in terms of like pushing the body too hard. So it's knowing when to, a bit like what we can learn from the blue zones, when to take time out and when to be physically active or exerting. So yeah, it's a good question.
We actually did a podcast earlier this year on the Goldilocks principle with Paula Wren and Alex Curtin. So yeah, we kind of did the hermetic story quite well there. And funnily enough, Paul is asking a question. So are there things such as reverse blue zones outside of big cities where people actually have a shorter lifespan? Have you read anything around that?
Oh, yes, I did somewhere. It was more to do with places in the. It was more to do with areas of the world where lifespan was not as long, and often when you look at those areas, we've obviously focused today on diets, location and exercise, but then you start building into things like the socioeconomic culture, the previous background, medical support, or kind of the access to medicines and hospitals, for example. When you start looking at all the infrastructure, education being a big one, yes, there is a pattern there in terms of longevity and rather reduced lifespan, of course. But I think it's also important to remember, if you go back, I can't remember all the stats off the top of my head, but if you go back to the average lifespan, I think in the UK, you go back to say that the turn of the century, as in the 1900s, and you fast track forward through to the 1950s, then the 2000s, we have seen this progressive increase in longevity in lifespan. What's more topical at the moment is the concept of health span. So being, having a larger percentage of your life where you're physically healthy and active and not in some form of disability or poor health. And those trends, the gap between health span and lifespan is kind of increasing a little bit in some of the literature, particularly in the UK. So we need to be more mindful of health span, I think, than just lifespan.
Yeah, very much so. And when you were talking earlier about reverse blue zones, I was thinking about the little villages here in Scotland where they haven't heard of a vegetable. And it's fish and chips for dinner and fried Mars bars and cornflakes for breakfast. Right, so thank you, Justin. I think we've done that topic pretty well and delved in. If anyone wants to find you, look at your work, how can they contact you?
I mean, the quickest way is just to type me into Google, just put Justin Roberts ARU, which is Anglia Ruskin University, and you'll get my webpage, and my contact details are on there. Very easy to contact at the university.
Thanks, Justin. I really appreciate the generous input of Justin and all my other guests on the Health Feeds Performance podcast. To listen to or to watch any of my other interviews, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on the main podcast channels. I'm also really keen to know what you would like to learn. So please go onto our website, intsportsnutrition.com, and contact us through the contact page. And while you're on there, just have a wee look at all the sports nutrition courses that we run. So until next time, bye for now.